To this podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Refugees and the Twofold Kingdom.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
Did you know there is a theonomy of the Christian left? From the early 4th century, when Christianity was declared a legal religion and properties were returned to Christians and persecution of Christians was forbidden, although it didn't go away entirely, the Christian church gradually became intertwined with the empire. Gradually, paganism was marginalized and then eventually made illegal. Emperors in the 4th century and following intervened directly in the life and assemblies of the church. The emperor convened the Council of Nicaea in 325. In 380, the empire sided with Nicene orthodoxy and declared its opponents to be heretics. In the East and in the West, Christianity gradually became the de facto and then ultimately de jure Christian religion, and that began in the East in AD 380. As with developments in worship in the 4th century, that century was also decisive for future patterns in the way that the church would relate to the broader culture. The church enjoyed more than 1,400 years of favored status. In the 16th and 17th centuries, during the Reformation and post-Reformation periods, the debate between Rome and Protestants on this point was not whether there is a true church that should be enforced by the state, but which one it should be, and wars were fought over that for most of 2 centuries, if not longer. Protestant resistance theorists asserted both a distinction between the church and the state and treated the emperor as if he were a new King David and France as if it were the new Israel. Scots Presbyterians arguably did the same thing in their theology of the national covenant or covenants. In the West, the privilege enjoyed by the visible church began to be dislodged by the various Enlightenment movements that would come to dominate the academy and the cultural elites for roughly the next 250 years. Still, as a practical matter, Christians continued to experience favored status until, in historical terms, very recently. In the West, it's only been since World War II and practically since the 1960s that the Christians have really noticed any profound change. In the 1960s, in the United States, school-sponsored prayers were declared unconstitutional. In the 1970s and 80s, the so-called blue laws began to be overturned, marking the beginning of the end of the state-sponsored recognition of Sunday as the Christian Lord's Day or the Christian Sabbath. Remember, though the American Constitution forbids any federally established church, state-established churches continued to exist well into the 19th century.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
One result of this long heritage of entanglement between church and state is that many Christians still default to what has been called the Constantinian model, which is maybe a little misleading, but there's something there. Obviously, Constantine was deeply involved in the life of the church, and he did use the state, even though Christianity wasn't yet the legal religion, he did use the state to enforce Christian orthodoxy and to punish heretics. We could call it the Theodosian model, since under Theodosius is when Christianity was first made the state religion, or we could talk about Christendom, but you know what I mean. They want the state to act like the church in a sense when it suits them. They want the state to do essentially church discipline. And we see this on the Christian right and on the Christian left. About a decade ago, or a little more than that, a Republican presidential candidate proposed a new federal agency to promote Judeo-Christian values. He also argued that, in view of the future judgment, Christians should support his vision of a social welfare safety net. The Christian right wants the state to enforce personal morality more aggressively. That was part of the attraction and force of the moral majority back in the 1970s and 80s. The Christian left wants the state to act redemptively in a corporate capacity. The state messianism of the Christian left manifests itself in the grounds given by the Christian left for their policy that the United States should receive and resettle large numbers of refugees. And you can see that in the latest manifestation in James Tallarico, who is the Democrat nominee for a Senate seat in Texas.
Idlecast.
Repeatedly, advocates of the policy of refugee resettlement and, in one case, Syrian resettlement in the United States invoke the Old Testament laws protecting the sojourner. For example, Deuteronomy 10:19, love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. They invoke some of the 613 commandments, at least as the rabbis counted them, which Jews and Christians confess that God gave to national Israel, and they apply them directly to the United States without so much as a by your leave. Every theocrat, theonomist, Christian Reconstructionist, and Christian nationalist says amen to this use of Scripture. One suspects, however, that the Christian leftist would not be pleased to see the state enforcing biblical religion at the point of the sword. It would be awkward to admit thousands of Syrian refugees only to prosecute the Muslim majority for denying biblical religion. We may be sure that the Christian leftist would be quite opposed to the state enforcement of Mosaic sexual codes. They want an enlightened, selective theocracy. There is an alternative. Even as they sought to reform the state church in England, the Westminster Divines confessed a very important and truly helpful distinction in the way that Christians understand the Mosaic law after the cross. And I read from Westminster Confession, chapter 19. God gave to Adam a law as a covenant of works, by which he bound him and all his posterity to personal, entire, exact, and perpetual obedience, promised life upon the fulfilling, and threatened death upon the breach of it, and endued him with power and ability to keep it. This law, after his fall, continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness, and as such was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in 10 commandments, and written in 2 tables, the first 4 commandments containing our duty towards God, and the other 6 are duty toward man. Besides this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel as a church under age ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth diverse instructions of moral duties, all which ceremonial laws, those would be religious laws, are now abrogated under the New Testament. To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. And finally, the moral law does forever bind all, as well justified persons as others, to the obedience thereof, and that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in respect of the authority of God the Creator who gave it. Neither does Christ in the gospel in any way dissolve, but much strengthen this obligation. So the bottom line for Westminster 19 is that there is a natural law expressed in the 10 Commandments, and then there were temporary laws, religious laws and judicial laws. And those religious laws and judicial laws expired with the death of Christ. The moral law continues to obligate all humans, both believing and unbelieving, and it is up to the magistrate to enforce not the judicial laws among the 613 laws under Moses, but the general equity thereof. And well, what is that? Well, the general equity thereof is, if we pay attention to the way it was understood when it was written, nothing more or less than the natural law.
This is the Heidelcast.
I can prove that pretty easily, first by looking at a passage from William Perkins' Cases of Conscience, which was published in 1631, obviously written decades before that, so long before the Westminster Assembly met, but he articulates what the shared understanding of general equity was. He says, but touching other nations and especially Christian commonwealths in these days, the case is otherwise. Some are of the opinion that the whole judicial law is wholly abolished, and some again run to the other extreme, holding that the judicial laws bind Christians as straitly as the Jews. And so basically, some don't think that judicial laws do anything today, and others are basically theonomists, he says. But no doubt they are both wide, and the safest course is to keep to the mean, and that is in between both. Therefore, the judicial laws of Moses, according to the substance and scope thereof, must be distinguished in which respect they are of two sorts. Some of them are laws of particular equity, and some of common equity. Laws of particular equity and condition of the Jews, commonwealth, and to the circumstances thereof, time, place, persons, things, and actions. Of this kind was the law that the brother should raise up seed of his brother, and many such like, and none of them bind us, because they were framed and tempered to a particular people. Judicials, meaning judicial laws, of common equity are such as made according to the law or instinct, now listen to this, of nature, common to all men, and these, in respect of their substance, bind the consciences not only of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles, because they were not given to the Jews as they were Jews, that is, a people received into the covenant above all other nations, brought from Egypt to the land of Canaan, of whom the Messiah, according to the flesh, was to come, but they were given to them as they were mortal men, subject to the order and laws of nature, as other nations are. Again, he says, judicial laws, so far as they have in them the general or common equity of the law of nature, are moral and therefore binding in the conscience as the moral law. And that's pretty typical for what you see. Archbishop Usher, who exercised some influence or effect on the framing of the Westminster Standards, has a catechism on this, and he says, what call you the judicial law? And he says, that wherein God appointed a form of politic and civil government of the commonwealth of the Jews, which wherefore is ceased with the dissolution of that state for which it was ordained, saving only in the common equity. That's the same thing as general equity. Is this law utterly revoked and abolished by Christ? No, for he came not to overturn any good government of the commonwealth, much less that which was appointed by God himself. May not Christian magistrates then swerve anything from those laws of government which were set down by Moses? In some circumstances they may, he says, but in the general equity and substance they may not. What judicial laws are immutably to be observed now of Christian magistrates? Those which have reasons annexed unto them, and especially those wherein God has appointed death for the punishment of heinous offenses. Amandus Paulinus argued something a little different from that. He wrote in 1610, thus much concerning inward freedom, now concerning outward freedom. The outward freedom is that which pertains to the outward life, and it is called Christian liberty because it belongs to Christians only. And that is twofold: freedom from the laws of Moses and freedom in different things. Freedom from the laws of Moses, that is, by which Christians are loosed from the ceremonial and judicial laws of Moses, namely so forth as they only pertain to the civil government under Moses for such laws which belong to the law of nature and by which all nations are bound are not abrogated. So that's the sense that really develops in the 17th century. So to the degree that the judicial laws reflect natural law, those laws are still binding.
The Heidelcast.
I'm at the big game, and man, is it exciting. They don't call it March Madness for nothing. The best teams in the nation are playing their best ball of the season. It all comes down to 6 games. When it's all over, then what? What comes after the tournament, after the crowds are gone and the glory fades? At the Heidelberg Reformation Association, we believe in a glory that never fades. God's glory, and the chief end of man, is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. You can help us point people to that unfading glory. Click on the donate button on the Heidel blog or send a tax-deductible check to the Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
Johannes Walabius, who was a Reformed theologian in Basel, and he published his little systematics in, 1626, about 20 years before the Westminster Divines were meeting, and he said the following: as the ceremonial law was concerned with God, the political was concerned with neighbor. In those matters on which it is in harmony with the moral law and with ordinary justice, it is binding on us. That meaning the judicial laws are binding insofar as they agree with the moral law. In those matters which were peculiar to that law and were prescribed for the promised land or the situation of the Jewish state, it has no more force for us than the laws of foreign commonwealths. So it's pretty easy to determine what general equity meant in the context in which the Westminster Divines were writing. Okay, so back to Westminster 19. The law that God gave to Adam in creation, the covenant of works, as I said, was restated in the 10 Commandments. That law we recognize as an expression of God's universal moral will. It was also frequently called by Christians the natural law. They distinguished between 2 tables of the law, the first table referring to man's duty to God, and the second to man's duty to man. The Divines confessed 2 other distinctions. They distinguished between the Israelite ceremonial laws concerning strictly religious or cultic matters, for example, washing and purification and sacrifices, and the judicial laws. And these were all fulfilled by Christ. The judicial laws, they confessed, expired, as you heard, with the Israelite state. All that is left is the general equity of them, and we've already worked through that. And by the way, you can see the function of general equity in Paul's instruction to Christians to submit to the pagan magistrate Nero in Romans 13. Nowhere in the New Testament does one even find the slightest whisper of a hint that the apostles sought state sanction, or much less imposition of Christianity, upon the Roman Empire. Indeed, after the apostles, the so-called epistle to Diognetus, really it's a speech, not an epistle, in chapter 5, and then also you could see the same in Irenaeus and Justin and Tertullian, right? In none of those did they ask the state to sanction or enforce Christianity. They only asked to be left alone. They asked to be allowed to opt out of the Roman state religion, which was pagan. Nevertheless, under the influence of what we could call the Constantinian settlement, virtually everyone in the Christian East and West was theocratic, or more precisely, establishmentarian in their understanding of church-state relations. And so they expected the state, or they came to expect the state, to enforce the first table of the law by the sword. After the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, and then progressively through the 17th century and into the 18th century, Christians began to raise questions about establishmentarianism. By the way, That's probably the last time I'm going to try to say that in this episode. That's why I say theocratic, even though it's not strictly correct. I mean, strictly, narrowly, theocratic means rule by priests, but we've come to use it to describe establishmentarianism because we need a shorter, easier word to say than establishmentarianism. Okay, there's three. I think I should get credit for that. I didn't crash and burn. In the American experiment, citizens agreed not to have a state-enforced religion, initially at the federal level and then by about 1833 at the state level. By the way, there were some colonies that never had a state-established religion. It wasn't like they all had a state-established religion. And I think it's interesting that the Congregationalists, with their over-realized eschatology, were the last ones to be forced by the courts to let go of the state-established religion. But that existed, that happened because of this Constantinian, we'll call it, assumption that there has to be a state religion. It's either going to be pagan or it's going to be Christian, even though the American founders said, well, actually, we don't think it has to be, there has to be a state religion, not at the federal level. And then, of course, people said, well, if we don't need one at the federal level, why do we need one at the state level? That's why the courts struck down the state churches. So we're still learning how to work out the consequences of distinguishing church and state, of learning how to look at the state as a secular institution. That is, as an institution that has no role in enforcing a favored religion. And we really need to recover this word secular, right? I didn't say secularist. I meant secular, which simply means not sacred. Right. If you're not a minister or a priest or a professional religious worker, you have a secular job. It's not a bad thing. It's not a dirty thing. It's not a corrupt thing. It's, again, really unfortunate that people have used the word secular, really abused the word secular to mean, opposed to God or something like that. It doesn't mean that. It's never meant that. It just means not sacred.
The best podcast, the Hylocast.
So, as I say, one consequence of a secular state is that it is improper for establishmentarians on the Christian right to use the levers of civil authority to impose their vision of the future, that is, their eschatology. So, too, it's improper for establishmentarians or theocrats or theonomists, really, is the most precise thing to say in this context, on the Christian left to seek to use the power of the state, the coercive power of the state, to impose their vision of the future on society. Right? Both are different versions of the Anabaptist desire for an earthly golden age, which the Swiss Reformed churches and other churches adopted, the Second Helvetic from chapter 11, which was published in 1566. And in chapter 11, part of it says, we further condemn Jewish dreams that there will be a golden age on earth before the day of judgment, and that the pious, having subdued all their godless enemies, will possess all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, I think it's rather likely that he was aiming at chiliasm, the idea of a literal 1,000-year kingdom on the earth. And this language actually is drawn from the Augsburg Confession, written by the Lutherans and published in 1530. They use the same language. So there's a Protestant consensus on this, but it applies wonderfully and almost perfectly to post-millennial Reconstructionism, post-millennial theonomy, and left-wing theonomy. So rather than ping-ponging between the theocracies or establishments of the Christian left and right, we should recognize that we live, as Calvin wrote, in a twofold kingdom, a duplex regimen. Surely we understand what that means differently from the way he did, but it's a good and helpful distinction. It means that we have duties to both the civil magistrate and to the church. As members of civil government, which all Americans are, that's best understood as a covenant of works, and under that sort of secular covenant of works, we advocate policies that are for the welfare of all citizens. That's why it is a commonwealth. Those policies are best grounded in natural revelation, accessible to all who will use their senses and rational faculties. By the way, This means that if people are going to be irrational, we don't have to deal with them. Right? If people are just going to scream and yell and stomp and stamp and break things, well, those people should just be arrested, and some of them need to be hospitalized because they're mentally ill, and if they commit violence, then they need to be put in jail until they decide to behave like members of civil society. As members of the spiritual polity, as Calvin says, represented by the visible church, which is a covenant of grace, Christians have a duty to show love and grace to those whom the civil magistrate admits to the Republic. The United States is not a new incarnation of national Israel, nor is it the church. It is a civil polity, a secular polity. And as such, it does things that the church cannot and should not do. For example, it bears the sword, which is a shorthand way of saying it puts people to death. It punishes people broadly, but ultimately it puts people to death when it needs to be done. The church is the Israel of God in Christ. The church does what the state cannot do, namely, show grace to the undeserving and administer the keys of the eternal spiritual kingdom. It's not always easy to know how to relate our duties to both realms simultaneously, and faithful Christians will disagree. But we have liberty to do that. One might think that it's good civil policy to admit refugees from wherever, and another might think it's foolish to admit thousands of people who don't like us, for example, don't understand us, and don't really want to be here. So we are having the sort of discussion that we should. The proper application of wisdom and natural law to secular civil law and policy, rather than having a debate about who is or is not a faithful Christian, using the machinery of the state to enforce their eschatology upon citizens who may or may not agree with them.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.